Okay, I've been asked to introduce our speaker today. I think we have a few people still trying to get on, so maybe we'll wait, give them another 50. Does anyone have any announcements or anything they'd need to mention? Okay, well, it looks like the number has slowed down here. So we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, which is Dr. Daniel Hayes, who is joining us today from not very far away, I guess, from the School of Forest Resources on campus, where he's Associate Professor of Geospatial Analysis and Remote Sensing. And he studies the impacts of climate change and different feedbacks on forest ecosystems. And we're happy to have him here today. And he's going to be giving a talk. And this is for affiliation with the Climate Change Institute. So welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be introduced by someone I've never met before. Hi,
I know. I was like, well, but very nice to meet you.
Yeah. And I haven't, so this is an affiliation talk. So thanks everybody for coming. As you may know, I don't know, this is all new to me. So so let me know if I'm not doing it right. I'm happy to switch gears. But this was a self-nomination process, so I feel kind of bad. I'm you know, like asking for your time to come listen to what I'm going to talk about. But hopefully it's worthwhile and interesting. And the ulterior motive being myself being interested in getting more involved with the Climate Change Institute and through this formal affiliation process. So so I will go through. I guess the standard is to share my screen. Is that the thing, and take away on a slideshow if that's cool?
Yep, that should work. You should have permission.
Yep, I do. Okay, and I'm not even going to be one of those people that ask, can you see my screen? Because I know you can, because I do this for a living now with my teaching, right? So so I know you can see my screen. And so as part of, I've met some of you at CCI, largely through, various things, but largely through the Maine Arctic initiative, which is meeting a few times. So we don't interact a whole lot. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more just by way of geography, I guess, for those that haven't met yet or are learning more about what they do. So so one of the people I have met is Carl, Professor Kreutz, and I share a homeland with him, for better or worse, when it comes to the sports teams. I went to undergraduate forestry school in Syracuse. And then I went to the University of Maine, of all places, for a graduate degree, for my master's degree. I had arranged a project with a professor to come up here and do something silviculturally, something I don't even remember what it was. But I went up to Alaska for the summer, and it was off the grid and everything. And I came back ready to go to grad school, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, your advisor, he up and skipped off to Corvallis." And so I was like, "Oh, great." So what do I do now? I'm here in Maine. So he's like, well, go, you'll be a TA. We saved you a TA. And I said, what am I teaching? And he said remote sensing. And I was like, what's that? So he sent me down the hall, and I met Dr. Steve Sater, and he was my master's advisor. So that's, whoops, that wrong way. That's important. But at the time, I got to work on NASA projects and land cover, land use change, tropical deforestation of all things in Central America. And then I went to do a PhD in Corvallis. That's the beavers, not the ducks, if you're keeping score. I did a postdoc up in Alaska, so kind of switched from tropical deforestation to Arctic modeling, which was a interesting and fun shift. And that got me involved in the Permafrost carbon network I wanted to mention, which some of you have interacted with as well. I put that in Florida because it was interesting to go from Fairbanks to visit I don't know, St. Pete and beaches and stuff, because Ted Shure was actually at the University of Florida at the time. Then I ended up going to Oak Ridge National Laboratory to working with a lot of carbon, North American Carbon Program work back in mid-2000s, I guess, flying also from Fairbanks. It would be 40 below there, and I'd get off the plane that would be 60 above. And I never thought I'd end up living there, but I did. I got involved in DOE projects and NASA projects up in Alaska, which I'll mention as well, Alaska and Western Canada. And that sort of brings me, I think, to where we are here, because I have a lot of, so the thing is, it kind of jumped around about a bit and going from different fields or different topics. And so it's hard to, I guess the point is I don't have like a real expertise to give like a specific science talk on, which I don't like doing anyway. So I'm going to give like an overview of different research that have been and more importantly are currently involved in. And for the idea that I'd like to see, you know, what other people are interested in, where there's overlap, where there's interested in collaboration on current projects, using some of the tools that I mentioned, potentially writing new proposals for project ideas. So I'm going to kind of just take a quick spin through some of these various aspects. And the way to kind of to at least give it some sort of a common theme is what I think of as basically carbon. So we can start there. And I thought if we talk about the kind of put this in the context of the carbon budget, of the carbon cycle, we can look at the different aspects and some of the different places that I've done some work and have interest in different work that may overlap with a lot of what you all do. So so that's my intro, and so we'll jump into it. And of course, when we jump into any kind of carbon talk, we always start here. Are there any questions? Okay. So the interesting part, though, of course, and to me is the real kicker here is the amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere is the source, and it's not what actually stays there. So the actual growth, the airborne fraction of CO2 is down here on this bottom plot, and the difference between what we put in and what actually stays there is the sink. And so that's what I'm interested in. So pretty much everything that we talk about from here on out has some way of looking at what is that carbon sink, how much is it, what causes it, and what is it going to do in the future. Okay, how's that sound? So when we're doing carbon budget analyses, we're balancing these sources and sinks, the sources being from fossil carbon and land use change primarily, and then looking at the ocean, land, and ocean and land sinks and what remains in the atmosphere. Now, I'm going to be talking mostly about the land. That's at least I have that much of a focus. I don't do much work in the ocean. The ocean, for those of you that work there, that that's the you can see where it's part of the carbon cycle here. It's kind of got this steady increase. It's kind of just physics, isn't it? I mean, I'm going to offend people here. Biology is a lot more on land anyway. It looks like it's a lot more complicated. There's biology in the ocean, of course, too. So, but this is the piece we'll look at. Largely, we get this land sink as the residual between what we can measure in the ocean and what we can measure pretty well in the atmosphere. We cannot measure very well what's going on land. I'm going to talk about that a bunch here. But we're trying to get a handle on what its magnitude is, what its variability is, and most importantly, like I said, what is it going to be doing in the future? Because at the moment, it's sort of saving our bacon somewhat, and we can manage it such that we can continue to save our bacon in terms of pulling up some of this fossil CO2 carbon. But to what extent we can do that in future and how is a huge question. Okay, so we'll start with these carbon budget analyses, and I've had the opportunity sort of to start again with introduction. I don't want to give too much life story here, but it sort of started for me back at around this time frame with the first State of the Carbon Cycle report. And this was put out by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and they looked at basically doing the budget for North America. So here are the fossil fuels from the 3 countries as the sources, and then they look at all these potential source sink of the different ecosystems, from coastal ocean to wetlands, agriculture. Forest was the largest sink. This is important. We'll stop here. So a lot of stuff we're going to look at, the sink is negative. We talk about a sink as pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So we measure it as a negative flux. Okay, so that's usually on the bottom. The sources are on the top, just to get that straight. So the forest is one of the larger sinks. Some of these other sinks are highly uncertain, whether the magnitude or even the direction of them. So this was sort of a first cut at this, and there was a lot of uncertainty. But it does things like gives us some estimation of, okay, so how much of the amount of fossil fuels that we emit into the atmosphere, how much actually remains there, or what percent is offset by some of these natural sinks, and where does that give us some levers from which we can manage things. So this led into sort of where I grew up scientifically in the NACP, North American Carbon Program, what they call the interim synthesis. So let's take all those uncertainties in that first report and see if we can drill down into what's going on with various things. So there was a whole bunch of studies going on here, and I just wanted to show this crazy slide because there's a lot of people involved, but there's also a lot of different methods, everything from field measurements, experimental studies of the effect of increased CO2 on plants, a bunch of flux tower studies, upscaling and syntheses. I don't know how many of you used to work with Taylor plots. They were all the rage back then. I don't even know what they are, but they look cool. There's people doing larger continental or mid-continental intensive with NOAA tall towers to look at CO2 exchange with the atmosphere and try to reconcile that with measurements in agricultural fields and things. And then a bunch of modeling studies as well from both the atmospheric perspective with transport models as well as the biosphere perspective from ecosystem models. So a lot of different stuff going on. The sort of try to keep track of all this stuff, you look at all these different pools and fluxes and try to put together your framework and think about which things are being measured or modeled by which different approaches. And so this is another kind of a wild, busy slide, but it's fun. I spent a lot of time making this back in the day. There's ecosystem models that are looking at sort of photosynthesis and respiration in the ecosystem, so you can see sort of what's coming up and what's going down, or model it anyway. Then there's the other bottom-up approaches of just straight up inventory. Let's measure it at one point in time and measure it at another time and look at the change between the two. And that's largely how our forest and agricultural inventories are done. And then there's this, the whole sense of this atmospheric modeling. So you have CO2 concentrations that you measure coming through on the Pacific coast, and then you measure what the CO2 concentration is when it gets out to the Atlantic coast, and it's different, right? And in the summer it will be much lower when it comes out on the eastern side, and you try to figure out where that carbon went with all these modeling techniques. So there's a bunch of different ways to look at it. We're not obviously going to go into all these details, but that's sort of where the next steps were to go. I have some highlights here of the things I'm talking about, but let's go to the next step. So the idea here is how I got involved is got together with inventory experts from 3 countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and data analysis. And we put together, basically looked at all these different, or 3 major categories of different approaches: the inventory data that I mentioned, the modeling, the biosphere modeling, as well as the atmosphere, so the forward models and the inverse models, and try to reconcile. So what's going on here? And what we did several studies, and I'll show here again, the negative values are the sinks, and there's different ways of looking at it. And so early studies, there's big differences between what the inventories suggest would be the sink, a little over 500 teragrams carbon per year, that's million metric tons, versus, I'm sorry, billion metric tons, 500 billion metric tons, much higher sink estimates from the atmospheric perspective back then. As time went on, these are studies when they were published, not studies of the actual sink at that point in time. But as time went on, there was a little bit more convergence between these different methods, including the biosphere models, but huge uncertainties among them. So if you're saying, oh yeah, we're matching up pretty well within the uncertainty, it's like, well, that's fairly good, but that's a low bar to cross when you can drive a truck through those bars. So we continued to sort of work on these inventories and putting things together in this synthesis sense to see if we can kind of reconcile the different components. And that led us to more recently the second State of the Carbon Cycle report, which was just released, I guess it's a couple years now. But I was excited to be involved in that. I got to lead with Rodrigo the chapter 2, which was the whole synthesis study. So I got to work with scientists from all different perspectives, different experts in different sectors and different methods. And so we went together and put together basically try to put together the carbon cycle for the continent with the latest and greatest information. And so I'm gonna just kind of run through this real quick just to get a sense of how this works and see where you might be interested in some of the different sectors here. But again, this is sort of high level, broad synthesis way of looking at things. So we always start with the energy sector and look at how much fossil fuel emissions. This is this is going to be shown in, again, in billion metric tons of teragrams carbon per year, over approximate decade, approximately the last decade. Let's say it's you know, a little bit squishy there in terms of the data, but we know the fossil fuel emissions with very high precision. That's what all these asterisks mean. The more, the better. So that's our biggest flux, but it's also our most well-known flux. We have very good inventories of that from all sorts of sources, but it's put out by the by the Energy Information Agency. But then the next thing we do is start to add up our land sector. So these comes from the inventory. So from the forest inventories of the US FIA, the Canadian National Forest Inventory, et cetera, we can put together inventories of forests, which we know very well. Similarly, there are more formal inventories for agricultural soils, so we know those fairly well. Some of these other ecosystems, we don't, you know, have formal inventories per se, but there's a lot of studies that we can put together and kind of do various scaling techniques to figure out maybe how much carbon is being changed and is changing carbon in those sectors. Again, this in this box is the change in the pool over the time period of about a decade. So in total, we've gained about just under 300 million metric tons of carbon in these land sectors on the continent over a 10-year period. This is per year. We also have to account for then some of these other fluxes like in transfers, such as wood harvest. And so we take out and look at and keep track of wood products pools, for example, and how much gets decayed. And then we can basically, it's just math. We do the balance of this box and figure out that must be a we infer a net flux into the ecosystem of about 451 teragrams carbon per year over this time period. Now, going back to this plot, that just under 500 number is still similar to what we've been getting before, and it's still much less of a sink strength than what the atmospheric methods would suggest. And so we're wondering, what are we missing here? Well, it turns out this particular the carbon cycle report number 2 here had a bunch more information in it about other ecosystems and other fluxes, including the aquatic flux and coastal margins carbon cycle. And so we were able to synthesize a bunch of this information. And this is the inland waters estimate for the budget, which is a certain amount in sediment that gets buried in sediment, a certain amount that gets outgassed from the water back out to this is CO2 back out to the atmosphere, and the lateral transport of dissolved organic carbon. And so again, just doing the math, we have to add this up, and we get about a half a petagram, so half a trillion metric tons of carbon being loaded from the land ecosystems to the aquatic systems and sent out on its way to do its various things. But the important thing is, well, there's a couple of important things in here. That is actually coming from the land sector. And so that's not included, that's not accounted for yet in any of our inventories. They don't actually measure that. So we have to add that back in because it came from the land. And if it came from the land, then it means originally it came from the atmosphere. So now all of a sudden we've got a much bigger flux, inferred flux from the atmosphere into the land sectors to account for all these not only vertical fluxes, but lateral transfers as well. And so then we can kind of follow this out the pipe per se through tidal wetlands, estuaries, into the coastal ocean and out to the open ocean eventually. And we end up then being able to balance our entire budget. And we come up with an estimate that we have added of the 1.8 trillion tons of carbon that released to the atmosphere, about 1 trillion tons of carbon per year stays there. So we can call that, and we kind of look at it as the airborne fraction, like I was saying. About 57% of what we put out in fossil fuel emissions actually stays there. So that means that there's about a 43, the sink strength is about 43%. And we can come up with these total numbers, add them back to our graph, and look at the latest atmospheric. These are these AIMs, atmospheric inverse models, and we can look at them, and they start to converge a lot better when we include all the components that we need to include in the inventories. And looking back at all these estimates, so you statisticians on here, don't get weird on me. This is not a trend line or anything. This is just me visualizing it. What I'm trying to say is over time here, as we've done these studies and published them and added new information and reduced uncertainties, that the estimates from the atmosphere versus the estimates from the inventories or bottom-up methods are starting to converge, and so that's encouraging. So that was the sort of findings, some of the key findings from this second carbon cycle report. Essentially, we can feel pretty confident that we're not missing anything big in our inventories. There's no big missing sink like we used to talk about 10 years ago. So that's good. So we know what we should be looking at. The other good thing to keep job security, of course, is that even though we might have all the components together and understand better how they all fit together, we don't have very good measurements for a lot of this stuff, and there's a lot of uncertainty left to drill into. And so that's where sort of part two of this talk can come in, is more current work based on in that context of these uncertainties, and where current work and current methods might be able to drill in on some of these uncertainties. And so to do that, I wanted to talk through just briefly. Again, we're going to be flying through a bunch of different studies just to give you a sense of things that I'm interested in, and some of the stuff that I'm involved with currently that we could potentially collaborate on as interest is. But one of them is, I'll go through these. There's basically, we'll look at some Arctic Boreal questions. This idea that the lateral, I got real interested in this after doing this report, that like, wow, that lateral transfer number is big potentially, but it's super uncertain. Like, we don't have a really good, I should have pointed out that there was only one asterisk on that number. So obviously it's potentially important, because it sort of changes our whole, it allows us to balance the budget, I think, but there's a lot of uncertainty in there. So I got really interested, even though I'm not an aquatic scientist whatsoever, got interested in that just because of how important it is for the budget. So we'll look at that real quick in some recent work. And then this is the continental scale synthesis, right? And so now I'm here at the University of Maine, and I'm in the forestry school, and we're a land grant. And so people come and ask me, like, well, Dan, I got, this woodlot, and what's my carbon cycle? And it's like, well, I haven't really worked at that scale. And so there's a lot of interest in how we sort of resolve this kind of information on much finer scales that can be useful for management and decision making. And so I want to kind of mention some of the ways that we're going there, and then that leads into sort of this longer term idea of how we monitor the carbon and how we predict what happen in the future for some of these regional scale assessments for the Northeast and for Maine in particular. So that's what part two will be here. So starting out with the big picture, there has been some good studies about being able to take forest inventories from around the world and figuring out their carbon stocks and stock changes over certain times to get a sense of the flux in and out of the forest sector. And this study found that they were able to account for the entire global sink just within the forest. And so that was an interesting finding that's been cited a lot, and as well as also challenged, I guess, in terms of the way science should work, is to go look in and see how well that holds up. One of the issues there is that those are from inventories, and there's a lot of area of forest that is not inventoried or not as part of formal. So for example, in the United States, we have the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program that measures a repeat cycle 5 to 10 years across the lower 48, a very high density plot network. But that's not the case in Alaska. We don't have a formal inventory network in the interior of Alaska, for example. Canada has huge swaths of boreal forest that are outside of their measurement network. So the point is that there's a lot of, we may have good information about some of these inventoried forests, but what about the ones that we don't inventory? And how do we get information on that? And so I've worked a lot with terrestrial biosphere models, land surface models, ecosystem process models. There are different names for them, but basically you don't have inventories, but you use field data, plot data to calibrate your models and look at the sensitivity to these different forcing factors like CO2, climate, disturbances, land use change, and things like that. And you can do sensitivity studies and come up with carbon budgets for regions that you may not have inventories for. And so this is just an example of a paper from a little while ago that looked at the boreal forest carbon sink and found that it's maybe not as strong as people had originally thought. And in fact, it looks like it's weakening. That's these black bars here. They're getting less negative or less of a sink. And the big reason is these big source effects from fire. And that have been happening in the 2000s, huge amounts of fires in Alaska and Siberia, for example. When you include those in the model, you get these big source effects. And the blue bars source effects are these climate impacts. Excuse me. And the climate impacts, of course, are the fact that it's warming twice as fast in the Arctic regions as everywhere else on the globe, and then that's going to make all sorts of feedbacks with maybe it's longer growing season, it's a more plant growth, more carbon uptake, but at the same time you have warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons, and more soil thaw, more soil respiration activity, and so more release of carbon back to the atmosphere as CO2 and methane. And so that's a positive feedback, which is not a good thing, but a positive feedback on climate warming. And so you can look at those sorts of issues with these models and do different on-off sensitivity tests in terms of the impact of warming and permafrost thaw, for example, on the carbon exchange with CO2 and methane to come up with carbon estimates of areas that aren't inventoried, like the Arctic tundra, for example. So there's a budget we can put together for that. So many of you probably have, some of you have interacted with the Permafrost Carbon Network, or most of you have heard of the Permafrost Carbon Feedback, which I've just mentioned. It's kind of a really fascinating, complicated story that a lot of people have done different work on, and I've been very fortunate to sort of tag along with that group, if I could say that. For the last 10, 15 years. And so there's been a lot of good studies about thinking about what are the rates of thaw, how much carbon is there up there in the permafrost soils. So how do we map that out? Incubation studies about, okay, if it thaws, how fast does it actually get respired back to the atmosphere, and as what, as CO2 or as methane? And so a synthesis of chamber studies and tower site measurements, as well as a bunch of modeling studies to try to predict what this might do into the future. So I'll refer to you to a lot of those studies to catch up on that issue. But one of the more sort of recent ways that this story is going is we've kind of got some sense of how much carbon is up there and how fast it will thaw. But that's this idea of this sort of press disturbance, so this gradual warming and thawing of the permafrost and gradual release of CO2 as it decomposes and is respired. But what we know is happening, but we don't know how much or what impact it's going to have, is that there are instances of a lot of instances of more abrupt thaw. And so this is where you have this general active layer thickening would be that press disturbance, but where you have a lot of ice in the permafrost, those ice wedges can melt out and the ground can subside rather quickly, changes the hydrology, changes the vegetation. This is called this thermokarst. And so there's lots of different successional pathways for thermokarst that really we're starting to study now and try to figure out, okay, how much of that is going on and where is it happening? Is it areas of little carbon or lots of carbon? And then what are the trajectories of change here in terms of their carbon fluxes as these disturbances happen? So that's a current area of interest. And so I've been working the last several years up in primarily out of the Seward Peninsula, out of Nome. And we have a bunch of study sites up there in conjunction with the Department of Energy's Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment, as well as the NASA Arctic Boreal experiment works up there. So I don't know if anybody's met Sean Serban, but I work with him a lot. He's from Brookhaven National Laboratory, has built a multi-sensor UAV system that we're using and to look at lots of different issues in terms of thaw, carbon fluxes, and vegetation changes and shrubification and things like that with these various instruments. So that's a pretty exciting current area of work until last summer when we couldn't go up, unfortunately for COVID. Also wanted to mention that to fill out these bigger budgets, we've actually implemented this DOC flux, these lateral fluxes and aquatic fluxes into some of the modeling. There's still a lot of work to do there in terms of the representing the processes properly, but it allows us to start getting some estimate of this so we can put our full budgets together in order to look at the carbon cycle of these boreal and Arctic lands that we don't otherwise have inventories for. And again, as I've mentioned, it also allows us to do modeling experiments to see the sensitivities of the system to different forcing factors and thereby be able to give us some sense of future scenarios for this. And speaking of aquatic export, as I mentioned, I've got interested in this, because it's such a big number but highly uncertain, and I'm starting to beat the drum with my modeling community that we really need to get a better handle on this if we're going to be doing these carbon budgets and having any kind of confidence in the overall system. So a series of studies that have been taken up by Xinhuan Wei, who is a recent graduate PhD student here, and he's now at Oak Ridge as a postdoc, but he put out this recent study that's real nice that's based on empirical modeling, but able to put together a carbon budget estimate for the aquatic piece anyway, for the continental United States based on watersheds. So interesting work there. So that sort of brings us to the last little part I wanted to just run through, because you're asking me, well, what about Maine, Dan? Maybe some of you are, maybe some of you aren't. Some of you might be asking, what about Greenland or Antarctica? I don't have any good info for there. But we'll come closer to home. So this is, as I mentioned, being a land grant university and trying to bring a lot of this carbon cycle science and some of the tools that we've been developing to some of these more regional and state level and more applied management type questions about what our carbon cycle is doing. And so we, as part of this, I believe Ivan might be on the call. So Ivan Fernandez and others from the university are involved in the Maine Climate Council. And we had gotten together just chatting about this stuff with Aaron Weiskell and Adam Dagnall and others, and talk, well, why don't we do a carbon budget for the state of Maine? It's kind of similar to what I had led for the synthesis of the North American carbon cycle. And so we kind of just pro bono got together once in every couple of weeks or so, but came up with a fact sheet that you can go check out online. And it's kind of a nice little sort of public consumption-ish type of a fact sheet that gives some information about these different sectors of the carbon budget in Maine and what the quantities of the fluxes are and the direction of the fluxes. And so we talk about the fossil fuels, the agriculture, urban areas, of course, the forestry, as well as some numbers for coastal ecosystems and the inland waters piece we had Xinhuan put together for the state. And so you can go check this out for some information on our website. It has more information here, but you'll recognize this budget here is basically the same sort of a conceptual construct as what we did for the continental scale carbon budget, but just drilled it down here to Maine. And what we found, is in the sort of back of the envelope preliminary estimate was that I think, what did I say, at the continental scale, the land sink was somewhere around 43% of fossil fuel emissions, whereas in Maine it's much higher, we think, and that's a couple of reasons. One is we have much lower population, and so less emissions, less transportation emissions and things, but much more. We're 90% covered by trees, and so and a managed forest too, and so there's a lot of uptake in the forest and storage and products that get us to this fairly large offset number for the forestry sector in terms of offsetting about 75% of the fossil fuel emissions from the state. So that's an interesting and useful information as the state looks towards its net carbon neutral goals. Although I do need to say that anybody gets the wrong idea, that does not mean that we're like getting real good at this and we can just like, oh yeah, well, let's let the trees grow. As we all know, that's one part of the solution, but reducing fossil fuel emissions is the number one task ahead of us. So not to take away from that. But meanwhile, so we put together these this kind of back of the envelope calculation for Maine's forests. That was based on FIA inventories, so the Forest Service inventories, but those only come around every 5 to 10 year cycle. They're field plots. They have to be interpolated within, and we've got this interest in using remote sensing technologies for reducing uncertainties in those estimates to make wall-to-wall maps rather than just scattered plots, as well as being able to update them more frequently, maybe even on an annual basis. And so this is where recent work, I'll just run through. Some of you may have met Elias Ayeri, who was here, graduated a year or so ago, and he put together all the airborne LiDAR data sets across the region that he could get his hands on and put and modeled the point clouds to with plot data to estimate biomass for every 10-meter grid cell across the entire region. So that's the kind of data products that we can start working with. Another graduate student who recently has moved on to Oregon State, of all places, is Jack Kilbride. He looked at using the entire Landsat record going back into the 80s to look at changes across the region, and Maine in particular. This is mostly going to be looking at how the vegetation indices that we use to measure vegetation cover have changed over this time period, and identify where there's been disturbances, primarily in Maine, that's going to be harvest. And it's just a credible. I probably should have done the whole talk on this because it's pretty amazing. But you can really see, for one, that these colors I'll mention real quick. The cooler colors are older harvests. The hotter colors are more recent harvests. The only place that you don't see like a ton or disturbances, the place that you don't see a ton of disturbances maybe is in Baxter State Park, but you can clearly see the outline of it there. But other places it's really hard to find anywhere in Maine that hasn't had harvesting over this time period. And so so that's interesting in and of itself. And we work with a lot of other scientists and here in Nutting Hall, even wildlife studies that can use this for looking at habitat and habitat changes. But basically what Jack did with that is took all these FIA plots again, as well as plots in Canada, and was able to model biomass based on their disturbance history, which is a pretty neat application for this information. So we've got even now we've got a way that we can not only map biomass wall to wall across the region, but Landsat data we can get, and every year we can update what the disturbance metrics and be able to model changes in biomass over time going forward. So that's a real exciting new opportunity. We've also looked at other ecological aspects of this. I mentioned current student Valeria Briones is looking at mapping forest phenology changes in Maine using MODIS data. So going back to year 2000. And this is stuff that we all know that spring is getting earlier here, but it's really cool how Valeria is able to put numbers on that now and tell us how much spring is advancing. For example, at least a week on average over the whole state in the last 20 years. And some of the places as you go further north, it's closer to 2 weeks. So really interesting information that we can map out on the landscape and do all sorts of analysis there. All this stuff we're thinking of putting together into a carbon monitoring system, as I've mentioned, looking at the changes in carbon with these disturbance maps, being able to update them with these samples of what these strips are representing from airborne LiDAR that we can collect. We've also excited that we just got a new NASA project funded from the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, or JEDI. This is these are lasers being shot from the space station, and so we can use those in our forest inventory and forest biomass models. We're also using many of you are probably familiar with ISAT-2 data, the green laser from a satellite. We can also use that to look at vegetation structure, and we're using that in our models as well. And so going forward with all this sort of data model fusion to be able to put together a system where we can look at the changes in carbon over it as we go forward, and help us make predictions into the future. I also want to mention, of course, that I'm at least nominally director of the Wheatland Geospatial Lab over here in Nutting Hall. And this is a really great program that I want everybody to be aware of, that we have all sorts of different tools and techniques and expertise that you're welcome to tap into or talk about ways to collaborate. One of the probably important things is that we have access to the priority research access to thankfully still to the university's airplane. You can see that there's a little pod on the bottom. We don't have much fancy for that yet, but I'm happy to write proposals to get some LiDAR or hyperspectral machines at some point. But we have in the meantime at least color infrared cameras that we can do fly surveys. Dave Sandyland is on staff of the Wheatland Lab, and he's a pilot and a highly skilled image analyst. So great guy to work with. We have a whole fleet of UAVs of different with different sensors of cameras, hyperspectral, thermal, working with various projects, again, with wildlife forestry. We do a lot of work with the forest companies in Maine, like Seven Islands and Nebraska-Hegan and these other companies to use LiDAR data in their plot inventories to to do what we call enhanced forest inventory mapping for their properties and their updates. And so a bunch of different things. We've gotten even into recent Catherine Chan recent grad student has studied, used UAV hyperspectral data to look at plant stress in blueberry fields. We're currently working with Acadia National Park and Scudic Institute to do bathymetry mapping with the airplane and UAVs down in Acadia for storm surge modeling and things like that. So all sorts of applications, and if you've got any ideas, definitely give a holler, and we love to talk about ways that we can use this technology right here on campus. So I think I can kind of end up here with a more larger synthesis of where this is going. I sort of mentioned we're trying to put all these pieces together in modeling. One of the exciting projects going on here is this larger, that many of you are involved in, this larger NASA EPSCoR Track 2 Inspires project, PI'd by Aaron Weiskettel there. I don't know what Inspires stands for. It's something or other, but basically we've got all these sensors being deployed and remote sensing and spatial maps being made for all these different ecological variables, and then those get fed into models to do diagnosis, attribution, prediction, and then they go on to decision support and outreach and a bunch of educational activities going on. This is a 3-institution collaboration with also with UNH and UVM, and so another exciting project to use this sort of information. Okay, so I'm going to call it good there. And sorry, that was long and strenuous. So I appreciate everybody hanging in there, and I'm happy to follow up with anything that anybody might have been at least vaguely interested in within that presentation. Thanks, everybody.
If I may pop in, Dan, that was fantastic. What a great overview, and I'd say you gave one of the best presentations for certainly introducing us to what we might be able to work on together. That was fantastic. Quick question. You may have shown this, perhaps I missed it. What are the best projections and how have they changed recently for carbon emissions from melting permafrost?
I didn't show that. So permafrost thaws, we'll say that first. It's frozen ground. So I think that the numbers to go through, I think I did mention that there's sort of the pieces to the puzzle are how much is there, how fast is it going to thaw, and then when it does thaw, what's the quality of it? So there's, is it all just going to blow up? That's the big bomb question. It's not going to be a bomb. We figured that out. So that's one piece of it. But in terms of stocks, I think the numbers, every time we do a new synthesis, the number gets bigger, which is interesting. So, but it's somewhere 2 to 3 times the amount that's in the atmosphere right now. So a lot. And that's just sort of the top 3 meters. And then there's all these studies going on about deep lost deposits and deltaic deposits in the Lena Delta, for example. Every time one of those measures gets more and more. There's a bunch of subsea permafrost that's also being wildly uncertain, as far as how much is there and how fast or if that would ever kind of come out in terms of emissions. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. So I don't know if I have a perfect answer for you there. I could come up, I could go back and look at some of the numbers to look at some of the estimates, but I think the story is it's not going to be, as when we started this stuff 10, 15 years ago, there was always going to be just this big bomb that goes off. No, that's not the case. It's more of a gradual thaw thing, but there's potentially a lot of carbon that could come out over the next 100 years. And the radiative forcing really depends on whether it's going to be mostly as, it will be mostly as CO2, but what's the ratio of methane that comes out? And so that's why a lot of this interest in thermokarst and disturbances is being studied, because of the landscape changing to a wetter situation will promote more methane emissions, and so therefore much stronger radiative forcing on climate.
Right. Just as a quick aside, I'm sure you were aware, but perhaps other people aren't. During the Cold War, there was considerable concern by the US government that the Soviet Union was going to set off atomic bombs in some of the deep methane pocket areas in order to melt the sea ice in the Arctic and have a northern sea port. And it was very seriously considered. But I guess one other question. based on the latest models, what's the compared to, let's say, the release of CO2 and methane today? What's the fastest rate that might be expected relatively? 2 times, 3 times in over a 5-year period or a 100-year period? Any thoughts or direction?
To rates as far as compared to how much is being released now versus
Yeah,
what?
let's say how much has been released in the last 20 years? Is there a 20-year period or 10-year period in the next 100 years when the rate could double? The rate.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. But it would. This is a great scientist answer. I don't know, but it depends. Again, it would depend on the rates of thaw. I think the rates of thaw have been shown to be pretty strong. It's super highly variable too in the Arctic. That's part of the problem with coming up with an answer. And so the issue is, I guess it would be mostly model projections, and there have been some that show. I wish I had it at my fingertips now, but the most recent modeling study by Dave McGuire from that Permafrost Carbon group, I think it really depended for number one on whether you're at a 4.5 or an 8.5 RCP scenario. But even at the 8.5, I think, yeah, they were looking at, if I remember right, it was about 2 to 3 times the rate of release of carbon in 100 years from now. Sort of
Right. But of course, none of these RCPs take into account very significantly methane release from frozen ground.
Correct, and that's why
it probably will, and then do a better job in the next assessment. Great. Well, I'll step out right now. Thanks, Dan. That was wonderful.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that a lot of this stuff is being done with the idea that the CMIP models that are making these projections for the IPCC do not really admit, and they'll admit it, they don't handle a lot of these permafrost processes, and so
Sure.
it's a huge uncertainty. And it's really hard to measure too. It's like you can measure carbon fluxes with a chamber, a flux tower on a patch of tundra, but you don't know. You have to get into like isotope studies and stuff to know if it's old carbon or new carbon or just normal active layer deepening and versus like real deep thaw. And so that's a big question too. Is if it's happening, how do we even see it? How do we know it? That's
Yeah.
Still trying to figure that out.
Just one more quick aside. I can't help myself. Sorry, but I've been listening to a lot of Arctic webinars lately, and I heard a Russian speak, and he said that 70% of Russia is actually underlain by permafrost, and obviously with even another degree or half a degree centigrade of warming, they're just going to have nothing but mush. They won't be able to get around at all, which they don't do that much on the ground, but nevertheless.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Unless they start grazing Pleistocene-like ungulates. If you've not heard that whole story, you should look up Pleistocene Park. Interesting studies. How to keep the permafrost frozen. That's another important point though. That says, we talk about I do a lot of forest carbon work, and it's like, well, there we can do various silviculture and store products and make sure that we have like a lot of levers we can turn and we can manage with forests. With this permafrost carbon, there's nothing you can do. You're just gonna have to stand back and hope for the best.
Well,
nothing you can do for the permafrost. Yeah. You can stop driving, stop emitting CO2 to the atmosphere is what we need to do.
The Russians are claiming that they're going to spray chemicals onto the existing infrastructure to keep it from moving around, but I have a lot of trouble imagining it's going to last or be very environmentally friendly.
Yeah, a lot of interest in the infrastructure issues too. I'm not an engineer, but that's a whole nother avenue of these kinds of studies for sure. Any other questions or thoughts or comments before everybody has to jump off to their next Zoom? Anybody have a interest in any other piece of this? Just let me know, and I'd love to talk more, whether it's getting some aerial imagery for your study site if you work in Maine. It's only we pay for fuel for the plane. That's it. So it's a pretty cheap endeavor, $150 an hour kind of thing. We've got lots of UAVs, and So if anybody's looking for data, we're always happy to do that. We've got people on staff. That's their job. So
Fantastic. No, I think there are plenty of interactive options for us, despite the quiet out there right now with questions.
I have a couple questions, Daniel. Do you have a breakdown of the energy sector, the different sources?
It's not at my fingertips, but it's in that. It's in
the report.
Yeah.
Okay,
and that
awesome.
comes from the state of Maine publishes it. I think you'd have to search around a little bit. But yeah, I'm looking at it now. I guess we can quickly share the screen again. Maybe not so quick. Almost there. Thanks. Yeah, so this plot here, it's a visual. We can come up with the numbers, but here's the different sectors: transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and electric power. The big drop off is in electric power. Happened 2002 to 2004 kind of time frame, but transportation, as terms of proportion, has increased, but its magnitude has been fairly steady over time. I guess we got to get fewer people from Massachusetts driving up here in the summers. That's who I would probably blame that on, but I don't know. It's probably other reasons. Trucks and things.
Lack of public transportation options.
Lack of public transportation, yeah.
And then my other question was about, so the asterisks in the numbers that in the figure, I forget which slides it was, but it was showing the sources and the sinks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the asterisks were representing just unknown numbers, but I was a little bit confused about that.
Yeah, seeing if I can get back to that there. So it's an uncertainty estimate. It's an I don't want to get into this whole thing because these are the kinds of things scientists spend way too much time arguing about. But while we were putting together this report, that's the best we could do. Is some places we had actual statistical uncertainty on these things, like with the forest inventories that have actual measurements. Some of these other things with very few asterisks or only one, that means more uncertainty, or it means we have less confidence in that number. Is what I think what it comes down to, even if it's not a quantified uncertainty. So we have very high confidence in the fossil fuel emissions. We can measure that fairly well. We actually measure what's in the atmosphere really well. We know what the global CO2 concentration is with really high precision. But in terms of how much DOC comes out of the soil and into a particular watershed, that's tough to really measure very exactly. So we have to sort of infer that sort of thing, and that's why those have less confidence.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions? All right, well, if no further questions, then thank you very much. This was a very enjoyable talk.
Well, thanks very much for having me. This was really fun, and I look forward to interacting with you all more in the future here. So reach out and see you soon. Talk soon. Thanks.
Thank you.